cloud. Okay.
Okay. We'll get started in a minute or two, but we want to welcome Andrew and Taylor. Anybody else joining you from Civico today?
And I guess the question is, which one of you will be handling the screen sharing, or both of you? So I can grant you those permissions.
Yes, Taylor, I believe you are.
Yes, please grant me those permissions if that's possible.
Of course.
Well, Taylor, I've made you a co-host so you can screen share.
Thank you.
And hang on, let's see. Oh,
I'm going to give our team an opportunity to filter in. I don't see everyone represented.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize for the different logons and the confusion, but I'm glad we have you here now.
so let's see here. Because presentation in my sheet.
Okay, Taylor, just let us know when you see everybody here. How are we doing now, Taylor? Is your team here?
I think we're all here. So I can get started. I know we have a lot of material to cover in a relatively short period of time. Just to confirm, we should be keeping this to 30 minutes. Is that correct? With another 20 or 30 for questions thereafter?
Yeah, 10, 15 for questions after, but yes.
Okay,
We've been
understood.
We've been running about 45, 50 minutes for the other
Okay,
presentations.
perfect. Well, I assume everyone can hear me, and just give me a quick nod. You can see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. So my name is Taylor Bearden, and I am a partner at Civico Development. I'm going to sort of handle the transitions and general introduction here, but I wanted you to get acquainted, at least by Zoom, with the photographs of the people you will be hearing from today. Andrew Consigli, managing partner of Civico, my partner, and then representing the Union Studio side, Don Powers, the founder of Union, and Jeremy Lake, senior associate, who is largely responsible for the site design, and we'll talk you through the majority of that information. So I know that Civico, doesn't have experience working on the Cape. And I think that's probably a worthwhile point to discuss here, because we, in our thinking about how to create the development team that would make us comfortable, make us feel that we are going to be a strong contender and a strong partner to the town, we had to pull together a team that gave us the confidence that we would be well advised and well supported in our efforts on the Cape and in Wellfleet. But so for this reason, I'd like to celebrate a couple of the accomplishments and sort of things that many of the members of our team have done on the Cape and the firms that they represent. So I think it's important to sort of explain why we're comfortable being here today. And these faces, some of them you may see during the Q&A. So a couple of people I want to just call out first. Bowler Engineering, first and foremost, they're really the reason that we're here. So I think that Bowler recognized in us that we have some experience and an aptitude for public-private partnerships, and particularly in places where contextual design and neighborhood sensitivity is really important. So we have a pretty long-standing relationship with them. We actually successfully permitted 63-unit mill conversion in Worcester this week with Bowler, and we have other projects pending. So when they approached us about this and said that the unique kind of conditions related to the public-private partnership, the wastewater treatment, and also the contextual architecture of Wellfleet, we were really interested to hear what they had to say. So I just want to call them out because they're the reason we're here, and Mark's experience and the team's experience with the feasibility study gave us a level of confidence that we would have the guidance we needed for managing this process moving forward. A couple other people I'd like to call out. Bill Henchy, our counsel for this project. He has a really interesting background on the Cape, and I think this will help you understand a little bit about why we feel that we have the representation and the breadth. So Bill actually was special counsel to the Wellfleet Conservation Commission when they were drafting the local wetlands ordinance. And he also has the municipal side. He's been a selectman, and I think that so far we have felt that he represents pretty fairly the kind of needs and motivations of the town, while also understanding where we're coming from. And that guidance has been critical to help us understand how Wellfleet in particular is ultimately the longest term stakeholder in this process. And we are a partner to the town. This is not our project, it's more the project of the people of Wellfleet in the future, and we're here to help facilitate using the skills and resources we bring to the table. KMLA, landscape architecture. Kimberly's been to literally every conservation commission on the Cape, and she brings a level of detail and expertise that is very welcome. But most importantly, I'd like to call out Union. Union Studio has a deep tie to the Cape, and I would do him a disservice. So I'd like Don Powers, founder of Union Studio, to just give a brief introduction to Union's expertise on the Cape. Don, are you present?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Taylor. Don Powers, founding principal of Union Studio Architecture and Design. We're a 30-person firm in Providence, and as Taylor said, we've had extensive experience on the Cape over the last 20 years, doing upwards of 15 built projects, and we haven't even listed the ones that are on the Cape, on the islands as well. So we know the area intimately, and I'm going to sort of not go much further than that yet, just to say that we are on the ground in the Cape in a third of our projects and have spent a lot of our effort trying to understand the Cape. And as I will explain a little later, that presence and expertise has been recognized not just by private clients, but by municipal clients and folks like yourselves. So I'll leave it at that.
So I'm going to hand off to my business partner, Andrew Consigli, to talk about why Civico. I think it's important that we explain how our project history informs our approach for 95 Lawrence Road. Andrew?
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Great.
Good.
So thank you for having me in Civico here. As Taylor mentioned, I'm a managing partner and principal of Civico. And so why Civico? So essentially, we'd like to essentially feature 4 recent multifamily projects that I hope you'll see a common thread of collaboration, high quality design and execution, in a project scale and housing typology that is similar to 95 Lawrence Road. So since 2014, Civico has sought out and developed projects that are meaningful, not only for our own purposes, but for all stakeholders. We're a small, nimble, and innovative development team that primarily focuses on creative housing solutions for communities in Massachusetts. Our goal here is to create raving fans, whether they are homeowners, tenants, neighbors, town and city staff members. So our first multifamily project, one that has been ongoing for a few years now, is in the existing neighborhood of Nonantum in the city of Newton. One of the 13 villages in Newton, Nonantum, is primarily made up of small multifamily homes that date as far back as the Civil War era. Civico has now completed 4 different multifamily infill projects in this neighborhood that consists of a total of 15 units of home ownership. Each home and building is thoughtfully designed to break down the massing and the scale of a typical larger multifamily building into a smaller, more human scale architecture. Each project takes into account parking and the pedestrian circulation in a creative way, whether the parking is hidden or tucked under the building. Each project is LEED certified and was entitled and approved through the city's special permit process, which typically involves a neighborhood outreach effort and collaboration with the Newton Historic Commission. The second multifamily project, called Abbey Road, not for the Beatles album, but for its previous use as a nonprofit, was completed back in 2018 in the town of Sherborne. So Abbey Road is a pocket neighborhood consisting of 18 units of senior housing within the historic town center of Sherborne. This was the first multifamily project to be built in the town in over 30 years. The project's focal point is Common Center Green, where the community comes together for social events and neighborly interaction. The design of the buildings create layers of private and public space that allow homeowners to kind of choose how they want to spend their time. Through creative site design and working with the natural slope of the site, we brought the vehicle to the rear of the building, as we do in many of our projects. So the front porches of each home look over a pedestrian-free space. Abbey Road became a reality through a collaboration with the town that consisted of a land swap agreement and also a zoning change at town meeting. Our third multifamily project is called Aurora Landing in Lincoln, Massachusetts, designed to fit in the rural nature of this suburban town, an area that is just a short drive to Boston. Aurora Landing consists of 60 mixed income apartments in 2 separate buildings that frame a large community space at the center of the project. This project was a unique public-private partnership with the town's Affordable Housing Trust, and also utilized community preservation funds, allocating approximately $1 million towards the affordable housing component of the project. The focal point is the community vegetable garden in the center, where residents can garden and socialize outdoors, a community house where they can socialize indoors, and a relocated original farmhouse that was on the property that was repurposed and renovated as a garden shed to be used in conjunction with the vegetable gardens. So other sustainable design techniques, such as a rain garden that collects all the rainwater for the site irrigation, and solar panels that will soon be installed to run all the electric in the buildings will soon be installed. So our last project, although a different scale and more urban than our previous projects, Ace Flats was just completed this past summer and is now being leased in the town of Reading, Massachusetts. And this 4-story project is a mixed income, mixed use, transit-oriented development in a newly created 40R smart growth district. The project received $1.4 million in DHCD funding in the first round and has been praised by the planning board and other leaders in the town for its contextual design. This project was a joint venture with Trevorth Companies out of Boston, where both firms work equally to co-develop Ace Flats. Trevorth Companies and Civico, because of the success of this project, are now working on a LIHTC project that is very similar to Ace Flats in downtown Winchester. So as I hope you can tell from our project experience, we have a broad range of project types, all focused on multifamily housing. There are common threads that weave throughout each project, such as design and site planning principles, sustainability, and collaboration with public, private, and nonprofit partners. So we thank you very much, and I'll now hand it off to back to Taylor.
So I understand everyone's read the RFP, and I'm going to do sort of a lightning round here to make sure we have enough time to go through the design. But I want to just highlight some of the key aspects of what we're proposing for 95 Lawrence Road in sort of a few statistics. And this will set us up for a Q&A later. So basically, as you're all well aware, we have 46 units of mixed income housing proposed between two primary building types. One, the single family cottages, and then what we refer to as the manor houses, which contain 4 units. Generally, these units will serve households with incomes between $20,000 and $85,000 per year. Now, this isn't an exact science at this phase. There are a number of things during the finance application process that will drive exactly what these income mixes look like. But generally, to get an idea of the kind of breadth of housing types we would be creating here, it would serve those income ranges at rents between $500 and $2,500 per month per unit. So just to give you an idea of what that actually means in terms of what occupations might be represented for potential residents, there is a pretty big range here. And as you all know, we're proposing a slightly different approach to affordable housing, creating what we call workforce housing with an array of affordability options. So generally, and this is not to do affordable housing 101, but basically capital A affordable housing, as we call it, just means that there's a deed restriction in place associated with a certain income level. So typically, what you might think of as a low-income housing tax credit project would be serving residents below 60% of area median income. As you can see from our proposed mix, if you look at the column that says AMI, area median income, we have a project that skews slightly higher than that, but still serves several at the ELI, also known as extremely low income, bracket of 30%. So the idea here is that what we can create is a diversity of housing options, because so much of the Outer Cape's housing market is regional. In order to have a really thriving housing market, you need a diversity of incomes represented. And by creating this sort of deed restricted middle income housing, you open the opportunity for renters who otherwise would be priced out in this kind of middle income range to have guaranteed access to housing that they can afford. Generally, we are looking at a parking ratio of about 1.5 spaces per 1 and 2 bedroom unit, and 2 spaces per 3-bedroom cottage. So that does not account for the 25 additional spaces we have around the ball field perimeter that are presently unallocated. The idea being that obviously, because this is sort of a public-private realm, there's going to be a number of uses for parking in addition to the residential spaces alone. So by leaving those unallocated spaces, we create a little bit of an opportunity for people to still enjoy the public space and for it not to be under parked. From a sustainability perspective, we're proposing fully electric buildings, and our site design makes the rooftop solar ready. Basically, although they're not shown on the site plan, creating a solar array, it would be essentially decentralized. So every rooftop, or the most favorable rooftops, would have one, but it would probably be networked together. This is something that requires significant further analysis. But the idea is that since we have smaller format buildings, you would have to have smaller solar arrays. But we're committed to a LEED or similar green building certification. But at this stage, it's too early to know what the right certification is for the project and for the time or the timeline when which this will get built. I know management was an outstanding question, and so we had responded to the RFP, and in the RFP there wasn't a requirement to identify a manager, and I want to clarify a little bit of why we took the approach that we did. So captive management, meaning if you're a developer and you have a management company in-house, that can be a really good way of managing buildings. And but it also can leave you unable to be flexible to respond to certain market needs. And in our case, we have found that it's very successful for us to be able to identify the right manager for the right project. And, just to give you an example, we have distinct managers for every project we have right now. And that allows us to really kind of get involved in the community, understand the specific community needs, and then to select a manager that's right for that project. Now, recognizing that we're new to the Cape, our thinking is that we would really like to get more involved and to start to understand what that landscape looks like long before committing to a manager, when we would be committing without enough information. But just, across 250 units that we presently have managed, we probably have 4 or 5 managers represented, and each one was selected for a different reason. In terms of site design and thinking about on-site management, the way we're thinking about this project is not as an apartment complex, but as actually building a neighborhood. So I think it's still an open question for us, and we designed the site such that we could accommodate this as to whether we actually need on-site management. But that's a company that, or that's a aspect that requires a lot further diligence with management companies and discussions with the town and neighbors to really understand what's the right approach for this project. I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to hand it back to Dawn Powers to talk about missing middle and design on the Cape.
Thanks, Taylor. As I said in my intro, that we've worked extensively on the Cape. One of the most significant projects we've done on the Cape is something that was commissioned for us by the Cape Cod Commission. And this was a study that we called the missing middle. And really, I offer that as sort of credibility that we are deeply invested in exactly the problem that Wellfleet has been trying to solve. How do you accommodate some of these needs for affordable housing? How do you do that in a form that is sympathetic and extends the local fabric rather than disrupting it? And so for this project, Community Resiliency by Design, the Cape Cod Commission commissioned us to originally look at 3 communities as model communities that were experiencing growth issues, and to develop strategies by which we could accommodate that growth in a density that was sympathetic. All density is not the same. Design is the key factor in whether density is offensive to the community or whether it's extensive of the community. And so we examined a number of different possibilities in that. The communities that we worked in were Falmouth, Orleans, and Eastham originally. Later on, we added Hyannis and Sandwich. But the primary point of this is that the Cape Cod Commission believes that we're one of the good guys. We're a mission-based firm that has been focused on solving these community problems since our inception 21 years ago. And we really treat it as our civic mission to solve this problem, exactly the problem that Wellfleet is grappling with right now. So next slide, Taylor, please. So just to define what missing middle is really the stuff between the left-hand house, little cottage there, and the right-hand apartment building. And it's all those forms of housing that existed in all of our communities until about 1940, when they started to be zoned out of existence and torn down and replaced with single-family houses. Obviously, not all of the forms that are represented here are going to be appropriate for Wellfleet, but they represent a menu of options that play well in a mixed environment and play well with both the single-family fabric that you have and in certain communities where it's appropriate with larger forms as well. Next slide, please. One example of the smaller end of this and how a sympathetic scale can be rendered in a density that is not necessarily traditional is Heritage Sands in Dennisport. This is a community of cottages, none of which have a footprint of greater than 900 square feet, but they've been deployed in a way that has a kind of a shocking density when you realize it. It's upwards of 8 or 9 units per acre. But the strategy is to focus on the communal spaces that are created to break down each of those groupings into their own little neighborhood. Next slide, please. At the other end of the spectrum this is an example that we would relate to our project we're calling the Manor House. These are bigger than what we're proposing at Wellfleet, but it's another example where you can take a multifamily structure and render it in pieces that are sympathetic or derived from the scale of a single family neighborhood. So this is currently under construction in Hyannis right now. Next slide, please. As an example of how that, both of those projects that I just showed were decidedly not affordable. I want to make that clear, but the same principles can be applied when all of the discipline that is brought to bear by an affordable project is in place. And so this is a project in Wickford, Rhode Island, for 38 units of affordable housing, where larger format buildings are broken into pieces that represent a scale, and you can create a walkable neighborhood feel out of that environment. So the summary I would make of this series of slides is just that this has been 21 years of honing our skill and how you make an appropriate scale for a neighborhood. And that neighborhood is always different. It's never the same type, or it's never the same combination of types. For instance, this is one in Brewster, Mass, and this was a single family neighborhood. There were no mix of types, but again, the scale and the density create something, if not altogether traditional, certainly pleasing and recognizable to someone who understands those kinds of neighborhoods. So just to reiterate, this has been our passion. We really don't make the distinction between affordable housing and market rate housing. It's all the same design problem. How do you fit into a neighborhood, and how do you do that in a way that extends the fabric of the neighborhood rather than kind of creating a rupture? So with that, I'll pitch it back to Taylor, who's now going to hand it over to Jeremy Lake, a senior associate in our firm, who's going to talk specifically about our proposal and how these principles of site design and the missing middle find their way into our proposal.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeremy Lake with Union Studio, senior associate, as Don just mentioned. And so looking specifically at the 95 Lawrence site, the first thing we did was sort of step back a little bit and try to see it in the larger context in Wellfleet. And we also found this was a very good sort of illustrative way of thinking about Wellfleet as a whole, as a community. Certainly Route 6 that you can see there cutting through the middle of the page. You can certainly find some larger format structures along that road, but those tend to be more commercial or institutional in use. So really what we were looking at was more of sort of the Wellfleet town center, the historic village core. We have an incredible amount of density, but all with smaller format buildings. We think that's a more sympathetic way of trying to address the need here at 95 Lawrence, whereas you can see there's a lot of single family in a lower density in the surrounding context. So this is the existing site that you guys are well aware of. Go ahead to the next one, Taylor. And what we did was a series of sort of analytical diagrams to sort of walk you through our thought process and what we were thinking about and seeing as we came up with the proposed site plan. First and foremost, the existing ball field. We actually had some initial conversations on our team as to whether or not it would make more sense to try to shift the ball field one way or the other, so that you could have the community be more consolidated on sort of half the site and the baseball field on the other. But in addition to the cost associated with that, the more we talked about it, we realized the baseball field is actually kind of a really cool potential focal feature for the entire community, and where it was made a lot of sense in terms of its relation to the elementary school across the site, which is the primary user of it. So in the end, we decided, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to actually keep the existing ball field where it is. We also realized it provided an opportunity, and I know Bowler had done a number of studies about this with the town, but just thinking about how we might approach the wastewater treatment need, both for this site and the adjacent structures that are part of this discussion. And certainly utilizing the outfield of the ball field as part of the leaching field area for the wastewater treatment site made a lot of sense. And we also started thinking through a little bit what we might do with some of the, the more utilitarian needs. Where do the pumps and the things go in some sort of structure? And so in the lower left hand, we're showing an image of a structure we've included at Maritime Landing in Dennis, where that building, half of that building houses some of the required mechanical equipment. But we've also combined it with our mail kiosks. And so the idea was that through sort of thoughtful and intentional design, even utilitarian needs can help in terms of placemaking and character building. And we were able to make a sort of communal amenity out of something that's somewhat utilitarian. And so we'd like to try to do something similar here. Obviously, a lot of details to be worked out as to whether or not that's the most feasible approach. But conceptually, that's what we'd like to try doing. Certainly, the existing water tank needed to be addressed. That's not going anywhere. And affiliated with that is the easement that delivers the water to and from that tank, which obviously needs to stay in place as well. So those were sort of the fixed items in the site. And so when we were thinking about the site access, we appreciated that it made the most sense to imagine coming and going primarily from Lawrence Road, trying to avoid Long Pond Road there along the south, because that does tie in primarily to the single family community. So what we wanted to create was this internal loop that basically circles around the field and through that easement and back down again to Lawrence Road, just to provide a multitude of ways in and out of the community. That also is really great for emergency access and other access needs for a wider range of users, including access to the water tank. One of the conversations we had with folks on the site during the site visit was whether or not the existing drive up to the water tank was sacred. Was that something that needed to be kept respected? Was there a lot of infrastructure embedded in there? And the answer we got in the field was that no, as long as their service vehicles could drive right up to the water tank and do what they need to do, it didn't necessarily have to be along that route. So one of the things we were proposing was thinking of our own internal site access also as access to the water tank, also emergency access, trash, all those things utilize those spaces, right? We also wanted to include a central green space that was about midway around that loop and recognized that was also a good way of accommodating and incorporating the water tank. So we included a central green space at that location, and also included basically a little sort of secondary loop that would go out and around that central green space, tying back to our main access loop. We also wanted to include a series of secondary greens, a pair of them on Lawrence Road, so that the project would have a public face to Lawrence Road, but the first couple of units wouldn't have to literally be right on the street. So they let us provide a little bit of a buffer, but a welcoming space, but then also a series of smaller ones distributed around so that all the residents have a small shared green space in very close proximity. Down in the lower right-hand corner where we already have the drive for the water tank service, we thought maybe it would be nice to include pedestrian access out that way. So residents, wanting to take advantage of a walk or a run along Long Pond Road could still get out there, since that clearing already exists through the trees. And then sort of the primary feature of our design is this notion of distributing the buildings. We've obviously been building up to that with everything we've talked about so far, but really thinking of this as a village, as a neighborhood, not as a single large format structure, because we think that is the most appropriate way of accommodating a lot of density on site, but in forms that should be fairly sympathetic and recognizable to the existing single family context. And associated with that is also distributed parking. So instead of needing one or two large consolidated lots, the idea is that the parking for the individual units can be distributed with the units themselves. And most of that parking actually can be accommodated on the primary site access and the secondary loop. We really only needed one little consolidated parking port, the one there sort of top middle, just because it's the one location where we had a few buildings that were back off of that primary loop. So we're able to accommodate the required parking, but in a way that, again, feels sort of broken up so it doesn't overwhelm. And last but not least, by trying to keep the development sort of as far west as we could, really trying to provide as much as a buffer as we could along Long Pond Road, recognizing those are primarily single family homes that are along Long Pond, and so wanting to sort of address that to the degree we could along that edge. And so this is the resulting proposal when you sort of take all those things into consideration. You can see the drive as it sort of works its way out and around the ball field. That's a 20-foot wide two-way lane that also should serve fire access needs, all the other sort of access needs. And you can see the idea is that the homes are sort of arrayed along that loop road. We think it's actually kind of cool thinking about the residents being able to look out and see a little league baseball game going on, that the units are out beyond the outfield wall, but sort of reinforcing the form of the field. So really thinking of that as a communal asset and really sort of strengthening the ties between this neighborhood and the broader community. This also, you can see the distributed, real quick, Taylor, the distributed green spaces. And one thing we didn't highlight in the diagram just is that there are walks, sidewalks, and trails that connect all of these things together. And so the residents have ample ways of getting around and connecting out to the broader community and to one another within the community. So with that, I'll pass it back to Don to talk you through the units themselves.
Thanks, Jeremy. So, the first thing that I would say is that the and it's a fairly obvious point that we would take our inspiration from the architecture of Wellfleet and the Greater Cape and Islands. There's a very strong established tradition of shingled cottages in the Outer Cape and the islands. And we're looking at those for clues of not only how to organize the buildings, but how to organize the site, how to define edges, what's the scale that's appropriate. So these were some of our inspiration images, and each of the items, the roses and the fences and the ribbon walks and the massing of the buildings will show up in our proposed architecture. Next slide, please. So for our architecture, Jeremy pointed out that the manor houses, each of which are essentially their footprint, their consolidated footprint is no larger than a single family house. But even beyond that, we've taken the strategy of dividing that form into a series of what we're calling connected cottages. Next slide, please. So you can see this overall form is about 50 feet by 25 feet, which is the size of a normal single family house. But next slide, please. In fact, that's composed of things which are much more of the scale of a 19th century sort of Cape cottage, which would mean that each block is something more like 24 by 24. And then there's a hyphen when that needs to be connected. So what you're looking at are the four unit buildings, but the strategy of taking this 4-unit building where there are 2 flats on the right and 2 flats on the left, but they're connected by this hyphen. You can see the direct lineage coming off of the precedents that we're looking at. So it's a way of again, reducing that scale, taking a 4-unit building and making it the scale of a single unit building, and then taking a single unit building and making that the scale of 2 cottages that are connected. There were comments in the questions about the size of the units, and one thing I would say that we took as our guideline, without being absolutely certain of all of the criteria to which we would be held, we designed to the DHCD design guidelines for the size of units that they are very clear in terms of what the maximum size for units are and what the features that need to be in that. Now, we did that as our most conservative approach. Certainly as the project develops, there might be opportunities to develop slightly larger units with more storage or other amenities that collectively as a team, we all agree are needed. But in this case, we've hewn pretty closely to the DHCD design guidelines. Next slide, please. And the set of materials is ubiquitous to the Cape. It's white cedar shingles and white trim and divided light windows, board and batten occasionally. Next slide, please. This is an example of a different type that omits the common stair in the center and opts instead for each pair of flats having a stair that accesses the second floor unit. Next slide, please. Again, it's the same strategy of connecting that with a lower hyphen that makes it read as 2 buildings. Note also that each entry is expressed to each unit. This is another way of breaking down the scale into smaller pieces where there are porches and overlooks and individual entries to give each unit a kind of primary entrance without having to come into a common lobby. Next slide. This is the single family units, the detached ones, which were behind the water tower, are 3-bedroom units with 2 bedrooms up, all in a familiar cottage form. Next slide, please. And this is how it comes in. One additional point I wanted to make is that it's not just the architecture, but it's the kind of the additional landscape elements. So if you go to the next slide, the fencing, and if you look closely in this rendering, it's sketchy, but we would propose that each of the essentially lots be lined with picket fences and plantings that further reduce the scale and separate what we call the semi-public realm in front of the house from the public realm of the sidewalks, et cetera. We think this is going to generate a scale and a street presence that feels very familiar to what people expect of Wellfleet. Thank you.
So I'd like to just wrap this up with a couple final points and a rehashing of what we think are the key themes in our proposal. So the first thing I want to say is that the other two respondents to the RFP are incredible operators. Between POA and TCB, I think they probably own or manage about 20,000 units across 11 states. And we're obviously not that. We own 250 units, which we manage with multiple management companies. And we have another 250 or 300 units in the development pipeline. And we have one office here in the Commonwealth, and we work here in the Commonwealth. We're a young company with in my opinion, an impressive track record that we've developed over the past 6 years. And we see the Cape as an opportunity to build on that story through contextual design and thoughtful development. And we partnered with Union for exactly this reason. They're like-minded in their desire to create what we see here as a neighborhood. So just to rehash, I think our proposal, we hope, has articulated that we think that there's an opportunity to develop a diversity of housing choices here. There are a number of funding tools available, and one of those tools allows us to create workforce housing. The design is very contextual, and our approach takes into account kind of holistic sustainability. And what we mean by that is more than just the features of green building, but it's about the design and the appropriateness and how a place will belong over time. And really kind of the last two pieces are together but separate. We feel that we have brought together a team that really helps us understand the local context, and we hope to be able to continue that and develop an opportunity to have a dialogue with the town of Wellfleet to figure out where, using this project proposal as a starting point, where we can take this such that it meets the needs of the town and the affordability goals in the context of the team that we have here before you. Thank you. So now I think, Elaine, should I hand it back to you? And we're open for questions.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Really fascinating. We probably have a few questions. Certainly, our interest in the way you propose funding this and the funding tools that are out there. We know that supposedly there's a lot of money being generated by the state for affordable housing. Does that align with the funding route you're looking at?
Yeah, so let me start with a broad overview, and if we have specifics, John DeBella from our team can answer those, and I'll queue him up if need be. So basically, and I think I alluded to this earlier, this idea of capital A affordable housing, meaning something that is deed restricted and kind of governed by the Commonwealth. So typically that would mean a 60% or lower unit in terms of AMI. Now, that's not the only type of deed restricted unit you can have. And so there are funding tools, although they're less lucrative, that we can deploy to the middle market. And I'm calling the above 60 and below 110% of AMI as that middle market window. And so the idea is that although we have less subsidy available on a per unit basis, the rents are higher, and therefore the project supports a higher level of debt. So it's almost a hybrid approach. It's like if you were to take a standard low income housing tax credit project like is being proposed by the other two respondents, those have a pretty established formula. The majority of funds are raised from tax credit equity. And in our case, the majority of funds are raised from debt, so private bank debt. But that gap is sort of closed by other subsidy programs that are designed to fill this kind of gap at the close to 80 to 100% of AMI. Because essentially what happens is that developers are incentivized to build to the most expensive unit they can in the market, because it takes the same level of effort. And so there is an actual kind of legislative justification for trying to build in subsidy at this middle market level, because it's sort of a forgotten place in the development of housing. And that's exactly why, to Dawn's point, those missing middle housing types used to fill that gap. But as those missing middle housing types get lost, we have fewer and fewer options for housing that meets the needs of the 80 to 100.
Taylor, can I offer one point?
Yeah.
The other thing I want to point out is that having done many low-income housing tax credit projects and done affordable housing in the methodology that Taylor is describing, which doesn't utilize low-income housing tax credit. The LIHTC program comes with an incredible amount of strings. You have a syndicator and you have the state, and there are so many people that, in my experience, it shuts off so many opportunities for creatively solving a problem in a way that is not adhering exactly to the template that's been done before. By proposing it in this way, we offer the opportunity to be creative and to create just variations in the design and the way it's deployed on the site that serve the needs better. So just know that although the LIHTC program offers the highest amount of subsidy, it comes with a pound of flesh in my experience, and it's very hard to get out of that box. And I think what we're all trying to do here is create a neighborhood that is not necessarily adhering exactly to an administrative box that has been well trodden before.
I think you're muted, Elaine.
Other questions from the committee?
Kathleen's got her hand up.
Yeah, a couple of things. Dawn, I don't think you could have stated that any better, that last comment from you. I think that's what makes Civico so attractive to me, because we would not be constrained. I've seen many developments across our region, and we've our committee did some site visits, and you know, you really don't get that neighborhood feel. You don't get that neighborhood look. What's missing from your presentation here for us this morning, and I guess it would go back to Jeremy's presentation with regard to the site plan. I'd like to hear more about, you know, landscaping, you know, what that is going to mean for the site with regard to you know, stormwater, keeping the natural vegetation. You have in your proposal to us mentioned one of my heroes of landscape, and that's Stephen Stimson from Falmouth, whose work is absolutely breathtakingly gorgeous with regard to organic and natural landscapes, not to mention what he can do with right angles and stone walls. But is there anybody that can speak to how this would be landscaped?
So I think this is Taylor Bearden speaking. I think I probably want to have Jeremy touch on that quickly, and then Mark from Bowler. Our landscape architect wasn't able to join us today. But Jeremy, can you just talk generally about how that relates to site, and then hand it off to Mark for some of the specific questions related to kind of ecological impacts?
Yeah, and again, I would first and foremost say we're architects, not landscape architects. That's why it's important to have that component on the team. I think, as Don highlighted, the way we think about it is often how the landscape can help reinforce some of the things we're trying to create, like public areas or semi-public areas, et cetera. Certainly in the same way that we think of the architecture being contextually appropriate, we would seek to make sure that the landscape architecture is contextually appropriate, using species and things you would expect to find on site, maybe reinforcing some of the patterns of the existing landscapes that are out there today. So I think it's a layer of design and detail that we've not been able to get into, obviously, at this stage. But I think we've got a pretty good team with it, and the assumption would be you would share those same principles that we're applying to the site design and in things like you mentioned, the stormwater design too. You know, we often try to make sure that, much like I mentioned with the utilitarian pumps for the wastewater treatment, the idea is to always, even the things that are utilitarian, how do you make those actually amenities by thinking about them thoughtfully, approaching them in a way that makes sense. And so even the stormwater would be, you know, we try to make that a landscape feature, not just a sort of ditch in the corner, if you will. So
Right.
I think there's a lot of detail to be worked out there, but the hope is it would be integrated and appropriate.
Before it goes to Mark, I just want to offer one bit of color onto Jeremy's comment. Union Studio and the people we work with, and this is going to sound terrible, we're profoundly conservative when it comes to design, in that what we always start with is what has worked. What has worked? What are the patterns in Wellfleet and on the Cape relative to landscape that are traditional and have been there. And the reason why they're traditional and the reason why that you see them is because they have worked. They work in terms of an ecological basis. They work from a design standpoint. So our first goal is to sort of do no harm and to avoid being slick or too witty in our lands, and work on the things that define a community like Wellfleet and have been seen in your most loved buildings. So the landscape is part of that. And that's why I was sort of trying to make the fact that there is no separation between how we see the buildings and how we see the landscape. It's part of a kind of analysis of what are the best patterns, and we would repeat those.
Thank you.
So with respect to stormwater, I think there's plenty of opportunities to do what's typically called low impact development under the Massachusetts DEP nomenclature. I think when Andrew mentioned that project in Lincoln, that seemed like one that would be very similar to what you might want to see here, where the vegetation is depressed and we can have some of the runoff go through the vegetation, also called rain gardens. There's plenty of opportunity for that. I think the design where the parking is spread out and not in one big sea of pavement is also very useful when we want to try and control stormwater in a better way. We can have curb breaks and have control the water in a different way than just a sea of pavement and catch basins. That's definitely not what this site would be. I think it lays out perfectly for all those types of stormwater features that would be integrated into the design.
Kathleen, I might be reading into your question a little too much, but I will make one comment, which is that in the lead up to this RFP process, we did canvass to try to understand a little bit what type of organizations already worked on Cape Cod that might help inform this discussion about landscape and ecology. And I had some discussions with a group called Resilient Roots, as well as Blue Flax Design, just organizations that, in my research and kind of referrals from others, were really kind of clued into the ecological preservation idea. And so we'll, depending on if this process continues, we'll continue to have that conversation and inquiry, because it's a really important part, obviously, of the Cape Cod has some pretty sensitive ecology, and it's critical that what we do here is a step in the right direction. And, I think we're all on board and recognize that within every discipline that we're working with here.
Harry?
Thank you, Taylor.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions. One of the things that we saw when we visited a project that I think was done about 15 years ago was a lot of window air conditioners, and the project manager said, well, they're really a headache. They're a maintenance headache for us because they're hard on the windows. They're noisy. We put them in and take them out. What are your thoughts on climate control, within the individual units? Have you given any thought to how, what tools you might provide for the tenants to be able to regulate their environment?
We have. So as part of the kind of overall sustainability strategy, as Massachusetts kind of evolves towards a decarbonization goal of 2050, our buildings have to keep up with that. And the strategy to do so is full building electrification. So the benefit of full building electrification is that a lot of the tools for heating and cooling we have are combined. So the idea right now is that these probably would be heated and cooled using the same system, and it would be electric. So the idea is that the residents would have the ability to control their own heating and cooling. And but to kind of add on to that, the delivery or the fuel delivery would be electric, which allows us then to benefit from, to the point earlier about solar panels and other kind of decarbonized energy sources.
Yeah, just to elaborate, it's probably what's called a air source heat pump mini split system. Mm-hmm. And a couple of the virtues of that is the condensers for those type of units are relatively silent compared to the old type. But more to the point, they can be run electrically very efficiently, which is a relatively recent development. And one point I forgot to point out about the roof shapes. You'll note as you look at our plan that all of the roofs are simple one slope roofs, no hips and no dormers and no things that complicate that roof. And that's to allow the deployment of photovoltaics in the most efficient way, which by the way is no longer simply south. east and west are also highly efficient as well. So we didn't show that in specifics, but part of the thought was to create simple roof volumes that will support solar that would then support these highly efficient heating and cooling systems.
Okay, thank you. I think I had a couple others. One of the things I wonder about is tension between the developer and the manager. So you have a problem, and is it a maintenance problem that you can tag the manager with, or is it a construction issue that you can tag the developer with? What's been your experience with having units managed by organizations other than the developer owner?
So I'm actually going to have Andrew comment on that, but before he does, there's an idea I'd like to present here, which is the idea that a developer who has an ownership interest in a property long-term, even though they may hire a property manager, they're still responsible for managing the manager. And that's a critical piece that doesn't get talked about. But the ultimate idea is that by hiring a property manager, you're really just decoupling the management of the tenants from the owner, but you're not alleviating them of the responsibility of management. And that's critical for a couple of reasons. One, because a manager without any guidance doesn't know the way to manage the property. And two, it's about upkeep, maintenance, and kind of aligning of incentives. A developer's incentive is to make sure their building lasts the longest and the tenants are happiest, there's the least turnover, et cetera. And that all has to get communicated to that manager. So I guess the point being that managers expect that they too will be managed. So that's a sort of well-worn path in this business. But Andrew, you might have some comments on our experience in Lincoln, perhaps, that might illuminate this, because Lincoln, kind of like Wellfleet, is it would be a unique situation where it's all about the community. And I say that to kind of set you up for that question, Andrew, but I think it's an important aspect.
No, I thank you, Taylor. And I think it's very important to kind of the projects that I was talking about earlier with Reading, for example, with Ace Flats, where, we received money from the DACD, and, it had a critical affordable housing component. We went and we did a quite extensive interview process, and we ended up with Wingate, which is a nationally renowned management company, and they were the perfect fit for that building, for that exactly that type of building, and the number of units and the location as well, and also they had other buildings in that area that they were able to pull from and create efficiencies. But just over a half an hour drive in Lincoln, it was 60 units, but in a much different setting. And that setting had to be more of an intimate, I think, setting, and much more of an approachable, I would say, management company. And it became a smaller management company. And again, we went through a very extensive, interview process for exactly that type of project. And I have to tell you, both Lincoln and Reading, fully stabilized, fully leased. And I think we picked the best manager for those particular projects. And I don't think that, flipping them around, I think they're perfect for those particular projects. And then finally, we have about 95 units in the city of Worcester, kind of in scattered sites in different triple deckers and multifamily buildings. And our management company out there is, the rents are different out there. Like you mentioned, replacing a light bulb or fixing something. We picked the manager out there that is actually a construction company as well. And we went through an extensive interview process, and we felt that the type of project that is was tailored very well to the manager that we picked. So there was 3 different instances of multifamily housing that we picked different managers for. And what's great is that we can keep each one of them accountable and know that we can, I don't want to say it, but fire them at any point for not doing their job and find someone else. Where, if it's in-house, it's a much harder thing within your organization to completely change. And we felt that's the reason why we don't have a in-house management, because it's actually a question that we've asked ourselves over the past 6 years. So hopefully that answers your question, and happy to answer
It does. Thank you. Just one last thing, and this is more of a, I don't even know if it's a question. I just note that there is a circular area around the water tower that the water commissioners need for access for maintenance, testing, painting, repair. And I just couldn't tell from the site drawings you submitted whether that area has been respected as part of your design or not. So it's not a question you need to answer today, but it's probably one that you will be asked at some point if you're selected to proceed with this development. So it's just an observation.
Yeah, and I'll just weigh in quickly about that. We placed the water tower, we placed a green at the base of the water tower with that question in mind. How much exclusive access do we need to provide, if any, was a question we were not clear on, because as I said or as Jeremy said, on site, we got some indication that the security was not as extreme as we might have thought it needed to be. So there is the space available to sequester the tower, a circular area at the base of the tower. We haven't shown that in the renderings, but if that is required, we certainly have the real estate to do it.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to alert you to the fact that issue might be lurking in the future.
Yeah.
And that's all from me.
Yeah. We're really coming to the end. I don't know if this can be quick or, as Harry said, future, but I was trying to understand your approach to the wastewater funding. You're funding your shared part of the cost. It looked like you were basing it on not the 44% that we had indicated, but something else.
So this may warrant further discussion because I don't think we'll necessarily unpack exactly why that doesn't look like the 44% to you, because it does to us based on a reading of the system that Bowler had advised us is most likely the system that would be pursued. So I think obviously the big piece of this project that requires a lot of back and forth and a real joint strategy is figuring out that. So the idea being that, yes, we had accounted for that. It is a sensitive figure in the pro forma, obviously, because that's a big chunk. And so if that were to oscillate wildly, it would just, modify the other assumptions we have in the project. But the idea here is that we did respect the ask in the RFP that we would be covering our relative portion of that, as well as that ongoing O&M contract that was indicated.
Okay. And just very quickly, one thing that you proposed that I hadn't heard of before is LIP Plus, meeting, meeting with boards and committees prior to going for the comprehensive permit.
So Bill might want to mention something here, but just to tee him up, the idea is tied in with what we had said earlier about the fact that we understand we don't have a track record on the Cape, right? And to sort of account for the lack of track record on the Cape, we would have to do a lot of engagement, outreach, et cetera. And that's a critical part of our process and would tie into the permitting process. Bill, do you want to mention anything specific on that?
Sure. So Bill Henchy from Orleans. I'm an attorney here on the Cape. And as Taylor mentioned earlier, I formerly was a select board member in the town of Brewster. And I've been involved in 40B work from the legal side of things and from the municipal side of things for many years. As we all know, affordable housing on the Cape is a problem that has been getting steadily worse. And as a result of what at least I perceive to be some structural changes in our housing market here, notably the introduction of Airbnb and other short-term rentals, which have had the effect of mopping up a lot of what was traditionally rental stock in the Cape. And now we have a lot of people working here remotely, so we've had a jump in our population. As you all know, the housing stock has very sharply contracted. It's become more and more difficult. So obviously the production of affordable housing is hard work. It's difficult. And it's been my experience that much of the objection to it is based on the fact that, according to a lot of the formulaic approaches, and some of that's been discussed here earlier, affordable housing doesn't always look like the community. And residents who are in reliance on their zoning bylaws and the aesthetic of the community where they've purchased homes are resistant to it. I think that there are two very important responses to that. One of which I think has been advocated here, and I'm very pleased to be associated with it, is a very careful approach to design and to the question of density, so that, as Don said, you extend the existing aesthetic of the neighborhood rather than detract from it and cause a rupture. The other obviously has to do with the community's response to an affordable housing project. Now, this is Wellfleet's land, and it is your development, and it is your right and your obligation to create the very best development here for the town that you can do. And it seems to me that if you simply look at the LIP regulations or the guidance, all a developer has to do is speak to you folks and then make a proposal to the select board. And if the select board agrees, you're in business, and then DHCD can review it and you can apply for a comprehensive permit. My own view is that that's an inadequate approach to it, and that there are many, many other interested boards and committees in town that it seems to me ought to have a crack at the proposal before it gets to the point of applying for comprehensive permit. So that's the reason why Taylor has sort of generated this LIP plus approach. And it's based on that perspective. In any normal permitting process, the Board of Health would get a crack at it, the Planning Board would get a crack at it, maybe the ZBA would have a crack at it. And then you'd have other interests in town. We have a Shellfish Advisory Committee in Wellfleet that's very active. You have any number of town committees that it seems to me are interested in this. So yes, Taylor has proposed LIP Plus, which involves touchstones with all of those boards and committees and anybody else who wants to have some input into the project. And that's really the basis for it. And it's out of a sense of promoting affordable housing that is community appropriate and in a context that the community welcomes rather than objects to.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today and your presentation. We really appreciate it. The rest of the committee, we'll see you at 10 o'clock Monday morning, right? Next meeting. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now because I think we're finished.
Yep. Yes, I think. Thank you, everyone. It was really a very interesting morning, and we'll have a lot to talk about.
All right. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you.